You're standing in a dimly lit corridor of the royal palace in Madrid, 1834. The air is thick with the stench of death and secrets. A hooded figure, a royal physician, beckons you forward, his trembling hands clutching a sealed letter. "This," he whispers, "is the truth they'll burn me for." You take the parchment, and as your eyes trace the words, a chill crawls up your spine. It's not just the death of King Ferdinand VII that haunts these walls. It's the grotesque truth of his reign, a truth so perverse, so forbidden, that history has buried it beneath layers of lies. You were never meant to know this. No one was. But tonight, you'll descend into the dark heart of a king whose body and soul were as twisted as the empire he destroyed. This is no fairy tale of crowns and glory. This is the story of Ferdinand VII, a man whose desires, carnal, cruel, and conspiratorial, warped a nation and left scars that still bleed in the shadows of history. Let's begin with the man himself, born into a bloodline poisoned by centuries of inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons wove a genetic tapestry of madness and deformity, marrying cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, until the royal lineage was a festering wound. Ferdinand, born October 14, 1784, at El Escorial, was the living proof of their folly. His parents, Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, were first cousins, their union a grotesque ritual of power preservation. From the moment Ferdinand drew breath, he was cursed, not by gods or demons, but by the reckless arrogance of his ancestors. His body bore the mark of their sins, a physical anomaly so shocking it would define his life and his reign. Court physicians, sworn to secrecy, documented it in coded journals hidden in Vatican archives. Ferdinand's manhood was no ordinary organ. It was monstrous, grotesquely oversized, unnaturally shaped, a thing of horror that defied medical understanding. One physician described it as a billiard cue, thin as sealing wax at the base, thick as a man's fist at its end, long enough to serve as a walking stick. This wasn't just a medical curiosity, it was a psychological prison. Imagine being Ferdinand, a boy destined for the throne, yet mocked in whispers by servants, courtiers, and even foreign diplomats. His condition wasn't just a private shame, it was a public scandal, a source of endless humiliation in a world that prized classical restraint. The Greeks glorified the small and refined. Ferdinand was a freak by their standards. His childhood was a crucible of dysfunction. His father, Charles IV, was a weak-willed hunter, more at home in the forest than the throne room. His mother, Maria Luisa, flaunted her affair with Manuel de Godoy, Spain's de facto ruler, in front of the court. Young Ferdinand watched this betrayal daily, learning that trust was a weakness, that power was the only currency that mattered. But it was his body that truly shaped him. The giggles of maids, the smirks of tutors, the averted eyes of potential brides, they burned into his soul. He saw mockery everywhere, and he wasn't entirely wrong. The court buzzed with cruel jests about the royal anomaly, and Ferdinand's paranoia grew like a cancer. By adolescence, the prince was already a study in cruelty. A court chaplain's memoir recounts a chilling incident. A young page accidentally saw Ferdinand changing and was flogged, his family exiled. The message was clear. No one could witness the king's shame and escape punishment. This wasn't just vanity, it was a desperate bid to control a world that mocked him. Ferdinand learned to wield his royal power like a blade, cutting down anyone who dared to see him as less than divine. His tutors noted his growing secrecy, his vindictiveness, his pleasure in the suffering of others. Servants who displeased him vanished. Courtiers who whispered too loudly found themselves banished. The boy who might have been a king of compassion was forged into a tyrant by the weight of his own body's betrayal. This physical curse wasn't just a personal torment, it was a political disaster. Ferdinand's condition made producing an heir nearly impossible. Royal physicians like Dr. Francisco Flores left behind secret notes that paint a grim picture. His member, they wrote, was of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form that normal intimacy was unthinkable. The base was narrow, the tip grotesquely swollen, with strange growth that served no purpose. At 10 inches in its natural state, it grew larger still when aroused, a nightmare for any bride. The court craftsmen were summoned in secret, tasked with creating marital aids, cushions, supports and oils to make the impossible possible. These weren't tools of love, but instruments of survival designed to protect Ferdinand's wives from physical harm. yet no cushion could shield them from the psychological horror of their duty. Ferdinand's desperation drove him to madness. He spent fortunes on quack remedies, potions of rhinoceros horn, powdered pearls, rare herbs, each promising to shrink his deformity or boost his fertility. Charlatans flocked to Madrid, preying on his insecurity. Every failed elixir deepened his rage, his sense of betrayal by his own body. By the time he married his first cousin, Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, in 1802, Ferdinand was a man on the edge. The wedding was a spectacle of royal splendor, but the wedding night was a descent into hell. Maria Antonia, a sheltered princess, was unprepared for the reality of her husband. When she saw him, she screamed, calling him a monster. The court physicians were called in, not for romance, but for a procedure more akin to surgery. Custom cushions were arranged, oils applied, and Maria Antonia was dosed with laudanum to endure the ordeal. What should have been love was a clinical nightmare, a ritual that left both partners scarred. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a battleground. Maria Antonia's trauma grew with every encounter. She became addicted to laudanum, a ghost in the palace, her body and mind broken by the demands of her role. Ferdinand, humiliated by her revulsion, grew more paranoid, more cruel. He began to see her as an enemy, a weak link in his quest for an heir. The court whispered of his growing sadism, his obsession with control. Special restraints were crafted, leather and silk devices to hold Maria Antonia in place during their encounters. Ferdinand consulted astrologers, mystics, even practitioners of dark arts, desperate to align the stars for conception. Twice Maria Antonia conceived, and twice she miscarried, her body unable to withstand the trauma of their union. The second loss, in 1805, nearly killed her. By 1807, at just 21, she was dead, officially of fever, but truly of despair, her life crushed by Ferdinand's relentless demands. The king's reaction was chilling. He showed public grief but private relief, already plotting his next marriage. Rumours swirled that he had poisoned Maria Antonia. Tired of her failure, the palace apothecary, who knew too much, was found dead days later, his cryptic letter seized and burned. Ferdinand's paranoia now had a body count. He was no longer just a man with a deformity. He was a predator, using his power to silence anyone who threatened his fragile ego. This was the man who would ascend the throne, a king whose personal shame would become Spain's nightmare. You're not just hearing a story, you're uncovering a truth that was meant to stay buried. This is the descent, and it's only the beginning. You're deeper now, standing at the edge of a chasm where the light of truth barely reaches. The story of Ferdinand VII isn't just about a man deformed by nature, it's about a king who deformed a nation, twisting its soul to match his own. The death of Maria Antonia in 1807 wasn't the end of his cruelty. It was the spark that ignited a reign of terror. You're not just learning history, you're uncovering a conspiracy of silence, a truth so vile it was erased from the books. Ferdinand's body was a curse, but his mind was a weapon, honed by years of shame and betrayal. As you step further into this abyss, know this. The secrets you're about to hear were meant to stay buried. They're dangerous because they reveal not just a king's perversion, but the machinery of power that thrives on lies and control. This is the knowledge that changes you, that makes you question everything you thought you knew about authority. Ferdinand's first marriage ended in tragedy, but he didn't mourn, he schemed. Within weeks of Maria Antonia's death, he was already hunting for a new bride, not out of love, but out of obsession. His condition, that grotesque anatomical anomaly, wasn't just a personal torment, it was a dynastic crisis. Without an heir, the Bourbon line risked collapse, and Ferdinand's ego couldn't bear the thought of failure. His physicians worked in secret, crafting ever more elaborate marital aids, devices that sound like instruments of torture rather than intimacy. Adjustable cushions, leather restraints, oils to dull the pain, these were the tools of a king desperate to prove his manhood. But the real horror wasn't in the equipment. It was in Ferdinand's growing belief that his wives were the problem, not him. He saw their fear, their revulsion, as betrayal, a personal attack on his divine right to rule. This wasn't just paranoia, it was a worldview that justified his cruelty. In 1808, Spain was crumbling. Napoleon Bonaparte, sensing weakness, invaded, forcing Charles IV and Ferdinand to abdicate. The Spanish people rallied behind Ferdinand, calling him El Deseado, the desired one. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know about the palace workshops crafting devices to make his marriages bearable, or the physicians whispering about his worsening condition. Some medical historians now suspect Ferdinand suffered from megalophallus, a rare hormonal disorder that caused his member to grow throughout adulthood, becoming more grotesque, more unmanageable. Court records describe it as a club with a thin handle, curved unnaturally, studded with growths that defy nature. Every new bride faced this nightmare, and Ferdinand's second marriage, to Maria Isabel of Braganza in 1816, was no exception. She was chosen not for love, but for her proven fertility. She'd borne children before. Ferdinand believed she could endure what Maria Antonia could not. The wedding night was a repeat of the first marriage's horrors. Maria Isabel, like her predecessor, was unprepared for the reality of Ferdinand's body. Her screams echoed through the palace, and the physicians were called again, their faces grim as they arranged the cushions and administered laudanum. But Maria Isabel was stronger than Maria Antonia, or so Ferdinand thought. She endured, though at a cost. Her pregnancies, like those before, ended in miscarriages, each one a blow to Ferdinand's fragile ego. He began to suspect sabotage, accusing Maria Isabel of secret plots to undermine him. He ordered her watched, her food tested for poisons, her ladies-in-waiting interrogated. The palace became a prison, not just for her, but for everyone who served the king. Servants who saw too much disappeared. Artisans who crafted his aids were found dead in alleys, their deaths labelled accidents. Ferdinand's paranoia wasn't just personal, it was a system, a machine that crushed anyone who threatened his image. This is where the story turns darker, where the king's private shame becomes a national wound. Ferdinand wasn't just fighting his body, he was fighting Spain itself. When he reclaimed the throne in 1814 after Napoleon's defeat, he didn't return as a saviour. He returned as a tyrant, dismantling the liberal constitution of 1812, jailing reformers and restoring the Inquisition. Why? Because he saw enemies everywhere, in the liberals who wanted progress, in the nobles who whispered about his condition, in the subjects who dared to question his divine right. His physical deformity had twisted his mind into a labyrinth of suspicion. Every reform was a personal insult, every critique a reminder of his shame. He ruled not with wisdom, but with vengeance, using the church and the military to silence dissent. The Inquisition, that ancient engine of fear, became his tool, rooting out heretics who were often just people who knew too much. But the court was where Ferdinand's darkness truly reigned. His obsession with the control extended beyond politics into the intimate lives of those around him. He demanded absolute loyalty not just from his wives, but from everyone. Courtiers were forced to swear oaths of secrecy about his condition, under penalty of death. One noble, caught joking about the king's royal scepter, was exiled to a disease-ridden colony in the Philippines. Another, a physician who suggested surgery to alleviate Ferdinand's condition, was found floating in the Manzanares River, his throat cut. These weren't isolated acts, they were a pattern. Ferdinand was building a world where no one could look at him without fear, where his shame was a state secret enforced by blood. His second marriage collapsed under the weight of his demands. Maria Isabel died in 1818, her body broken by miscarriages, and her mind shattered by Ferdinand's cruelty. He blamed her, just as he'd blamed Maria Antonia, for failing to produce an heir. By now, the court was a house of horrors, a place where whispers were treason and truth was a death sentence. Ferdinand's physicians, desperate to solve the heir problem, began experimenting with surgical techniques, crude, dangerous procedures to reshape his anatomy. These experiments, conducted in secret chambers beneath the palace, were as much about control as they were about medicine. Ferdinand wanted to bend his body to his will, just as he bent Spain to his rule. The results were catastrophic: infections, scarring, and a worsening of his condition that only deepened his rage. By 1819, Ferdinand married again, this time to Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony. She was young, devout, and utterly unprepared for the nightmare awaiting her. The pattern repeated: the wedding night, the screams, the laudanum, the restraints. But Maria Josepha was different. She resisted. She refused the drugs, refused to be a passive victim. Her defiance enraged Ferdinand, who saw it as a challenge to his authority. He ordered her confined to her chambers, her contact with the outside world cut off. She died childless in 1829, officially of heart failure, but the court whispered of poison, of a king who couldn't tolerate a wife who wouldn't break. Ferdinand's marriages weren't just failures, they were battlegrounds where his insecurities waged war on the women he claimed to love. This is the halfway point, and I need you to do something. If you're feeling the weight of these truths, if you're ready to go deeper, comment below with the phrase "I see the shadows" twice. This isn't just for me, it's for you, a signal to yourself that you're stepping into the forbidden, that you're claiming the knowledge they tried to hide. Do it now, and let the algorithm know you're one of us, one of the seekers who won't bow to lies, because what comes next is even darker. Ferdinand's reign wasn't just about personal cruelty, it was about a system of control that stretched beyond the palace, into the heart of Spain and its empire. You're not just a viewer anymore, you're a witness to truths that could change how you see power forever. The empire was crumbling, and Ferdinand's paranoia fueled the collapse. His condition, his shame, his need to dominate, they bled into every decision. He saw Spain's colonies, its people and its future as extensions of his own body, to be controlled or destroyed. The liberal movements sweeping Europe terrified him, not because they threatened his throne, but because they threatened his image. He crushed them with a ferocity that shocked even his allies. The Inquisition burned books, tortured dissenters, and silenced anyone who dared speak of reform. Ferdinand wasn't just a king, he was a god in his mind, and gods don't tolerate mockery. His physical deformity had become a metaphor for his rule, oversized, unnatural, and destructive to everything it touched. You've crossed the threshold now, deeper into the shadow years where the truth about Ferdinand VII festers like a wound. You've seen the man, the monster, shaped by a body that betrayed him and a court that mocked him. But this isn't just about one king's perversion, it's about a system of power that fed on fear, secrecy, and control. Ferdinand's reign wasn't an accident. It was a masterclass in manipulation, a blueprint for how elites twist nations to serve their desires. You're not just hearing a story, you're being shown the gears of a machine that still turns today, hidden behind the lies of history. Every step you take into this darkness reveals more, not just Ferdinand's cruelty, but the way he turned Spain into a mirror of his paranoia. This knowledge is dangerous because it forces you to see the world differently, to question who holds the reins of power. When Ferdinand reclaimed the throne in 1814, he didn't just rule, he consumed. The Spanish people had called him El Deseado, the desired one, believing he'd save them from Napoleon's grip. They didn't know the truth. Their savior was a predator, his mind warped by years of humiliation and his body a constant reminder of his shame. His anatomical curse, described in secret medical texts as a grotesque club and unnaturally curved, studded with growths, wasn't just a personal torment. It was a political weapon. Ferdinand believed his physical flaw made him vulnerable, so he built a fortress of fear around himself. The liberal constitution of 1812, a beacon of hope for a modern Spain, was his first target. He tore it apart, declaring it an insult to his divine right. Why? Because any system that gave power to the people threatened to expose him not just as a king, but as a man. The Inquisition, that ancient engine of terror, was Ferdinand's perfect tool. He revived it with a vengeance, turning its flames on anyone who dared whisper of reform or worse, of the king's condition. Priests and spies became his eyes and ears, infiltrating homes, churches, even bedrooms, to root out dissent. A merchant who questioned taxes was branded a heretic. A noble who laughed too loudly at a banquet was dragged to a dungeon. The court records, buried in dusty archives, tell of men and women tortured for crimes as vague as disrespecting the crown. But the truth was simpler. Ferdinand saw every critique as a jab at his manhood, every rebellion as a mockery of his body. His paranoia wasn't just personal, it was institutional, a system designed to silence truth and enforce loyalty at any cost. This wasn't chaos, it was control. Ferdinand's court was a microcosm of his mind, a place where fear ruled and secrets were currency. His third wife, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, learned this the hard way. Married in 1819, she was a devout, fragile girl, barely 16, chosen for her purity and obedience. But obedience wasn't enough. Ferdinand demanded submission, not just of her body, but of her soul. The wedding night was a ritual of horror, like those before it. The cushions, the oils, the laudanum to dull her screams. But Maria Josepha fought back, refusing the drugs, defying the physicians who treated her like a specimen. Her resistance enraged Ferdinand, who saw it as a personal betrayal. He confined her to her chambers, cut off her letters, and ordered her watched day and night. She was no longer a wife, she was a prisoner, her spirit crushed to feed his ego. Maria Josepha's defiance didn't last. By 1829 she was dead, her body wasted by stress and her heart broken by isolation. The official report said, heart failure, but the palace whispered of poison, of a king who couldn't tolerate a woman person who wouldn't break. Ferdinand's marriages were more than personal failures. They were experiments in domination, each wife a test of his ability to bend others to his will. His physicians, complicit in this nightmare, pushed their experiments further. Secret chambers beneath the palace became laboratories where they tested new marital aids and surgical techniques to reshape Ferdinand's grotesque anatomy. These weren't acts of healing, they were acts of control, attempts to force his body to obey him as he forced Spain to obey. The results were gruesome: infections, scars, and a condition that grew worse with every failed procedure. Ferdinand's paranoia spilled beyond the palace into the empire. Spain's colonies in the Americas were rebelling, inspired by the same liberal ideas he'd crushed at home. He saw their uprisings as personal insults, as if the colonies themselves were mocking his manhood. His response was brutal. He sent armies to slaughter rebels, draining Spain's treasury and weakening its grip on the New World. By 1825, most of Latin America was lost, not because of military failure, but because Ferdinand's obsession with control blinded him to strategy. He wasn't fighting for Spain, he was fighting for himself, for the image of a king who could never be questioned. Every defeat fueled his rage, and he turned that rage inward, tightening his grip on Spain's people. The court became a house of mirrors, reflecting Ferdinand's distorted view of the world. He kept lists, secret, obsessive lists, of those he suspected of mocking him. Nobles, servants, even priests found their names scrawled in his private journals marked for punishment. One chilling account from a royal scribe describes Ferdinand pacing his chambers at night, muttering about mockers and traitors, his hands clutching a dagger. He ordered executions on a whim, banished families for rumours, and rewarded those who fed his paranoia with gold and titles. The palace craftsmen who built his grotesque aids lived in terror. Several vanished after completing their work, their bodies found in ditches or not at all. Ferdinand's logic was simple. Anyone who knew his secret was a threat, and threats had to be erased. This was the heart of his reign, a system of psychological control that turned Spain into a prison. The Inquisition wasn't just about religion, it was about silencing truth. Ferdinand used it to create a culture of fear where neighbours spied on neighbours, where a wrong word could mean death. He didn't just rule by force, he ruled by breaking minds, making every Spaniard complicit in his paranoia. The liberal intellectuals who dreamed of a free Spain were tortured or exiled. The press was gagged, books burned, ideas outlawed. Ferdinand didn't want progress, he wanted worship. His physical shame had become a national policy, a twisted mandate to make everyone feel as powerless as he did. And yet the people still called him El Deseado. Why? Because the truth was hidden, locked away in Vatican archives, burned in palace fires, or buried with the bodies of those who knew too much. The propaganda machine run by Ferdinand's loyalists painted him as a saviour, a king fighting to preserve Spain's glory. They didn't see the screaming wives, the secret surgeries, the lists of the condemned. They didn't know that their king's greatest enemy was his own body, and that he'd sacrifice a nation to prove it wrong. This is the knowledge you now hold, the truth they tried to erase. It's not just history, it's a warning. Power like Ferdinand's doesn't die, it evolves, hiding in new forms, new faces, new lies. You're halfway through this descent, and I need you to lock in. Comment, I see the shadows twice below right now. This isn't just for the algorithm, it's for you. A mark of your commitment to the truth. You're not just watching, you're awakening. The next section takes us deeper, into Ferdinand's final marriage and the collapse of his empire. You're ready for it because once you see the shadows, there's no turning back. You're in the heart of the abyss now, where the shadows of Ferdinand VII's reign grow thicker, blacker, suffocating. The truth you've uncovered isn't just a story. It's a revelation, a key to understanding how one man's shame can poison an empire, Ferdinand's body, his grotesque deformity, wasn't just a personal curse. It was the engine of his tyranny, a twisted force that drove him to crush anyone and anything that threatened his fragile godhood. You're not just listening, you're witnessing the mechanics of power, the way it feeds on fear, lies, and silence. This knowledge is a blade, sharp and dangerous, because it cuts through the illusions we're fed about kings, governments, and the systems that rule us. As we descend further, you'll see how Ferdinand's final marriage and the collapse of his empire weren't just failures and horrors. They were the inevitable fruits of a mind and body at war with themselves. By 1829, Ferdinand was a king without an heir, his 3 wives broken and buried under the weight of his demands. Maria Josepha's death left him raging, not with grief but with desperation. His condition, described in hidden medical logs as a monstrous organ growing still, defying nature's limits, was a ticking bomb. The Bourbon dynasty hung by a thread, and Ferdinand's paranoia reached fever pitch. He saw enemies in every shadow, traitors in every glance. The court was a graveyard of trust where nobles lived in terror of his lists, his spies, his sudden executions. Yet the propaganda still called him El Deseado, a saviour king, while the truth rotted in secret chambers. His next move would define not just his reign, but Spain's future, a final marriage to Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, a woman chosen not for love, but for her resilience, her proven ability to bear children. She was his last hope, and he would break her to make it real. Maria Cristina, married to Ferdinand in 1829, was different from the others. She was 23, strong-willed and politically savvy, a woman who understood the game of power. But nothing could prepare her for the nightmare of Ferdinand's bedchamber. The ritual was the same, the cushions, the restraints, the oils, the physicians, hovering like vultures. Her first sight of Ferdinand's grotesque anatomy, now worsened by years of failed surgeries and infections, sent her into silent shock. Unlike Maria Antonia, she didn't scream. Unlike Maria Josepha, she didn't resist. She endured, her face a mask of duty, her body a sacrifice to the crown. But endurance came at a cost. Court letters, smuggled out by her ladies-in-waiting, describe a woman hollowed out by trauma, her nights spent in tears, her days in dread of the next summons. Ferdinand saw her strength as a challenge, and he set out to break it. This marriage wasn't just about producing an heir, it was about control. Ferdinand's physicians, now desperate, pushed their experiments to grotesque extremes. They devised new devices, mechanical contraptions to stabilize his member, surgical tools to carve away the growths that made intimacy a nightmare. These procedures, performed in secret basements, were barbaric. Blood-soaked bandages, screams echoing through stone walls, and infections that left Ferdinand feverish and raging. Yet he pressed on, driven by a need to prove his virility, to silence the whispers that mocked him. Maria Cristina bore the brunt of this obsession. Her pregnancies, 2 daughters, Isabella and Luisa, were miracles of endurance, each one a battle against her husband's body and his cruelty. Ferdinand, instead of celebrating, grew more paranoid. Daughters weren't enough, he needed a son to secure his legacy, and he blamed Maria Cristina for failing him. This obsession with an heir wasn't just personal, it was political dynamite. Ferdinand's decision to abolish the Salic law, which barred women from inheriting the throne, sparked the Carlist Wars, a bloody conflict that tore Spain apart. His brother, Don Carlos, claimed the crown, backed by conservatives who saw Ferdinand's daughters as illegitimate, tainted by his deformity and his liberal-leaning wife. The court became a battlefield, with factions plotting against each other, whispering of poison, betrayal, and the king's unnatural condition. Ferdinand's paranoia fueled the chaos. He saw Carlists as mockers, liberals as traitors, and his wife as a potential enemy. He ordered her watched, her letters intercepted, her allies purged. Maria Cristina, once a proud princess, became a shadow, her spirit crushed by a husband who saw her as a tool, not a partner. The empire was collapsing under the same weight. Spain's colonies, already weakened by Ferdinand's brutal campaigns, broke away one by one. Mexico, Peru, Argentina, gone by 1830, lost to rebels who saw through the myth of El Deseado. Ferdinand didn't care about strategy, he cared about dominance. He sent armies to die in jungles, bankrupting Spain to prove his strength. At home, he tightened the screws. The Inquisition burned brighter, targeting not just liberals but anyone who questioned the king's divinity. A poet who wrote a veiled satire about a deformed ruler was tortured until he confessed to treason. A priest who preached mercy was exiled to a plague-ridden outpost. Ferdinand's lists grew longer, his punishments crueler. The palace was a fortress of fear, where even the air felt heavy with secrets. The craftsmen who built Ferdinand's marital aids were now prisoners of their work. Their workshops, hidden beneath the palace, were like torture chambers, filled with leather straps, metal braces, and oils that smelled of despair. Some artisans tried to flee, but none escaped Ferdinand's reach. One, a master leatherworker, was found hanged in his shop, his tools scattered, a warning to others. The king's physicians too lived in terror. One, who suggested a radical surgery to normalise Ferdinand, was poisoned, his body dumped in a sewer. These weren't accidents, they were executions designed to keep the king's shame locked away. The truth about Ferdinand's body was a state secret, guarded by blood and fear. This was the system Ferdinand built, a machine of control that fed on silence. He didn't just rule Spain, he infected it, turning neighbours into spies, friends into enemies, truth into treason. His deformity wasn't just physical, it was a metaphor for his reign, a grotesque force that twisted everything it touched. The people still cheered him, blind to the horrors behind the crown. Propaganda painted him as a father, a saviour, while his wives bled, his subjects starved, and his empire crumbled. This is the truth they didn't want you to know, the truth that changes you. It's not just about a king, it's about power, how it hides its ugliness, how it demands your worship while it destroys you. You're deep in the shadows now, and I need you to stay locked in. Comment, I see the shadows twice below right now. This is your mark, your proof that you're not just watching, you're awake, ready to face the final descent. The next section takes us to Ferdinand's end, the legacy of his reign, and the echoes of his tyranny that still haunt us. You've come this far. There's no turning back. You've reached the deepest part of the abyss, where the shadows of Ferdinand VII's reign swallow all light. The truth you hold now is a fire, burning away the lies that history has fed you. Ferdinand wasn't just a king, he was a force of destruction, his deformed body and twisted mind a mirror, for a system of power that thrives on fear, secrecy, and betrayal. You're not just a witness, you're a keeper of forbidden knowledge, the kind that shifts the way you see the world, the kind that makes you question every throne, every institution, every story you've been told. As we stand at the end of Ferdinand's reign, you'll see how his final acts and his death left scars that still pulse in the veins of power today. This isn't just history, it's a warning, a call to see the shadows that still move behind the curtains of authority. Maria Christina's marriage to Ferdinand in 1829 was his last desperate gamble for an heir, but it was also his final descent into madness. She was different, strong, cunning, a survivor who navigated the treacherous politics of the Spanish court, but even her resilience couldn't shield her from the horror of Ferdinand's bedchamber. The grotesque ritual, cushions, restraints, oils and physicians, played out again to encounter a battle against his monstrous anatomy, now ravaged by years of failed surgeries and infections. Secret medical logs, hidden in Vatican vaults, describe a body in decay. His member, once a billiard cue, was now scarred, swollen beyond reason, a living nightmare that defied human limits. Maria Christina endured, not out of love but duty, her silence a shield against Ferdinand's wrath. She gave him 2 daughters, Isabella and Louisa, but no son. Ferdinand's rage was volcanic. He saw her success as incomplete, a mockery of his manhood. These daughters sparked the final catastrophe of his reign. By abolishing the Salic law to allow Isabella to inherit, Ferdinand ignited the Carlist Wars, a civil conflict that would bleed Spain for decades. His brother, Don Carlos, backed by conservative nobles and the church, declared the girls illegitimate, whispering that Ferdinand's deformity made true heirs impossible. The court fractured into factions, each side wielding rumours of the king's condition as a weapon. Maria Christina, now regent in waiting, became a target. Ferdinand's paranoia turned on her, suspecting her of plotting with liberals to undermine him. He ordered her rooms searched, her allies arrested, her every move watched. She was no longer a wife but a pawn in his endless war against betrayal, her daughters proof of his power, but also reminders of his failure to produce a son. Ferdinand's body was failing him now, ravaged by infections from his botched surgeries. The palace physicians, once complicit in his experiments, were now terrified. One who suggested amputation to save the king's life was found dead in his bed, his lips blue with poison. The craftsmen who built his marital aids faced the same fate, silenced, their workshops burned to erase evidence. Ferdinand's lists of mockers grew longer, now including his own family. He suspected his daughter's nurses, his wife's confessor, and even his guards of spreading rumours about his condition. The palace was a tomb, its halls echoing with fear, its walls stained with the blood of secrets. Yet outside, the people still cheered El Deseado, fed lies by a propaganda machine that painted Ferdinand as a divine father, not a tyrant who crushed his nation. Spain itself was breaking. The loss of the American colonies left the treasury empty, the people starving and the army mutinous. Ferdinand's obsession with control had gutted the empire. He sent soldiers to die in futile wars, not to win but to prove his strength. At home, the Inquisition burned brighter than ever, its fires fed by anyone who dared speak of reform, of truth, of the king's shame. A bookseller who printed a pamphlet questioning royal authority was burned alive. A noble who hosted liberal salons was exiled, his family ruined. Ferdinand's reign wasn't governance, it was vengeance, a crusade to make Spain feel the same powerlessness he felt in his own body. His deformity wasn't just physical, it was the soul of his rule, a grotesque force that twisted everything it touched. By 1833, Ferdinand was dying, his body a wreck, his mind a labyrinth of paranoia. He lingered in agonies, refusing treatment, convinced his physicians were plotting to expose him. His final days were spent scribbling lists, muttering about traitors, and clutching a dagger he no longer had the strength to wield. When he died on September 29, 1803, the official report cited natural causes, but whispers told a darker story. Poison, perhaps from Maria Christina's allies, desperate to secure her regency for Isabella. The truth was buried with him, his body preserved in secret rituals to hide the extent of his deformity. The royal physician tasked with this preservation fled Madrid, his notes burned, his fate unknown. The palace closed ranks, and history was rewritten to erase the king's shame. But Ferdinand's legacy didn't die. The Carlist Wars raged on, splitting Spain between those who backed Isabella and those who saw Don Carlos as the true heir. The conflict wasn't just about succession, it was about the same fear and control Ferdinand had wielded. His daughters, raised in a court of terror, carried his shadow. Isabella II's reign was marked by corruption and chaos, a faint echo of her father's tyranny. The Bourbon dynasty limped on, but Spain never recovered its glory. The colonies were gone, the economy shattered, the people broken by decades of fear. Ferdinand's reign wasn't just a failure, it was a blueprint for how power can consume a nation, how one man's shame can become a system of oppression. This is the truth they didn't want you to know, the knowledge that changes you forever. Ferdinand's story isn't just about a perverse king, it's about the machinery of power, how it hides its flaws, how it demands worship while it destroys. You see it now, don't you? The shadows aren't just in history, they're in the institutions around us, the lies we're told, the truths we're forbidden to speak. Ferdinand's deformity was his silhouette, but his real crime was building a world where secrets rule. You're not just a viewer, you're a seeker, a man who's seen the shadows and chosen to face them. So here's your final charge. Comment, I see the shadows twice below right now to mark your place among those who know. This isn't just for the algorithm, it's for you, a vow that you'll carry this truth, that you'll question the powers that hide behind crowns, titles and lies. Ferdinand's reign is over, but the systems he perfected live on. In governments, in elites, in the stories we're told to keep us blind. You've descended into the abyss and come out changed. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? The shadows are watching.